Africa Prime, brought to you by Jameson's Select Reserve.
Welcome back. You're watching Africa Prime. Let me just recap who we're talking to. We're talking to Daphney Mashile-Nkosi. She's the chairwoman, or chairman as she wants to be called, and I'll explain why in a second. She's chairman of Kalahari. She's also the chairman of Kalahari Resources, Women's Development Bank Investment Holdings, and Pinnacle Technical Holdings. And this company is listed on the stock exchange. It sits on 5 companies and is a director there. Daphney, when we were talking before the break, we were talking about where you had come from and how you came up to be this feisty woman who does not take male domination for granted. But you also stood up for your brother. What was it that made you, younger sister, stand up for an older brother from bullying at school?
I think I was...
Were you a bully?
I was not a bully.
You must have been a bully.
I was a baby in the family of 4. And therefore the crumbs were coming to me, and I got tired of actually getting the crumbs. I wanted the real thing. And I think even my sister, when she was actually dishing up at home, she would give herself a big piece of meat.
Oh, she did?
And she put a smaller one big underneath the pap. And she would say, you see, I've given myself a small piece. And I would go for that small piece because I knew somewhere inside the pap, there was a big piece waiting for her.
Do you remind her now?
I do.
And what does she say?
Well, we laugh about it, but I think it's that environment that actually made me to want to know more.
Talk to us about growing up in that environment. We're talking here in the 1960s,
Yes.
Getting into the 1970s, a time fraught with suffering for black people in South Africa.
Growing up in the 60s, where my mother was standard 3, unemployed, my father was the only one who's working. If you think of poverty, if you think of malnutrition, I had it all. I mean, I had kwashako. We were one of those families that were actually seen as, declared families that would actually get ration. They used to call it ration. You go to the clinic, you get peanut butter, you get milk. Every Wednesday morning you go there, you don't go to school.
This is from the apartheid government?
This from the apartheid government, some kind of feeding scheme for poor families. And we were part of those families. And at school, because my mother was not a teacher or a nurse, we were right at the bottom of the pit when other children had sandwiches with cheese, with eggs, with sandwich spread. We had nothing. And I remember butter soup, butter beans soup. Yeah. My mother would put and get a brown paper and say, here is a sandwich at school, and the other children would laugh. And I think I was shaped by that environment. At school, my brother was very quiet, and he was being bullied at school, and sometimes he couldn't go to school. And I said, I think, you know what? I think I empathize, I sympathize, I stand up for others. And that actually followed me. If you look at how I grew up, that is why I ended up with being a class of 76, but also starting to work with rural women, because I felt that they were right at the bottom of the pit, because not only were they discriminated by the apartheid government, but also at home, never given an opportunity to take decisions, but also legislation prescribed that the minority status of African women under customary law, and there was the KwaZulu Code, in terms of the black local
There was so much that was happening here.
Yes.
There was so much anger here.
That was not allowing women to become who they are. It went further to say, I don't have a status as Daphney. The only status that I have is that of my husband.
So you rebelled. You were 18, 1976, part of the group that said, no.
This far and no further.
Take us back. How did it start?
I went to...
That day,
we knew on the 13th, that on the 16th we were going to march. We were going to march from Skanontwane High School in Snawane. We were going to then take those from Morris Isaacson, and we were all going to converge at Matsike High School, which is Orlando High, to fight, of course,
this is
around...
also Soweto.
Yes, Afrikaans as a medium of instruction. I was affected by that because I was the creme de la creme of the school in terms of the class that I was in, because I was doing maths and science, because I was one of those that were, clever or better than the others. I was not in a home economics class, but more on the maths. There were only 2 girls. Right. It was me and a lady called Yvonne. And
she remains your friend.
She remains my friend. She's a dentist. And we share so many things common. We widows, so when we're in trouble at night, we talk to each other. We remain friends. But it started way back then. So
sure.
It affected us, Africans affected us, because we did Weskende, we did Adroiskende, which is geography in Afrikaans, and it was actually very difficult. So when there was a match, we were there. And that's how we started. But it went on even beyond that day. When Henry Kissinger came, we had placards. One of my best friends... This is the
former U.S. Secretary of State.
Yes. When he came, we were, there with placards, peaceful. And one of my friends was shot at Scanlontown and killed.
When was this?
In 1977. And I think that also affected me more to become more active.
Yeah.
And when I went to prison, I rebelled. I was in prison.
So you protested on that fateful morning?
On that fateful morning again for the second time. Because, from June 76, when people were shot,
yeah.
we were there, to help them.
Were you arrested that day?
I was not arrested that
June
day.
16.
I continued to become an activist. I was arrested later. I was a founder member when COSAS was formed in 1979.
Yeah.
In 1981, when the Internal Security Act was promulgated, or Internal Security Act, I was detained as well. I was also detained again in 1988, so I know prison like the palm of my hand. I read the Bible from the first page to the last page, I think, more than 20 times.
What you get in the surveys is that, yes, you're getting upliftment. Yes, black economic empowerment is making a difference in some respects. But as you were saying earlier, it's largely because it is benefiting men. But on the other hand, women, particularly rural women that we started off with, have not seen the benefits of the economic transformation that the government is effecting. And from your way you sit, is that because the government hasn't done enough in terms of putting together the environment and the legislation that's required to try and make that happen?
I think the environment is there. The legislation
What is
there.
missing?
What is missing is encouraging those that are actually the men that are taking some of these decisions,
right,
to believe in women.
These are now also black men. So,
exactly.
Yeah.
Because how they were socialized, how they were brought up. By the way, sometimes they were actually brought up by the women that we're talking about.
Sure.
And therefore it doesn't happen overnight that they can actually switch. If you look at, for instance, if we were to be presented with an opportunity today, a business opportunity,
yeah,
what comes to mind is the men that you actually grew up with,
sure,
and not the women. But when it comes to issues of getting married and so on, you are actually attracted to women. Yeah. But when it comes to business, we're still struggling as black men to actually be attracted to women as business partners.
Yeah. So you have now traveled this very long and tough journey from the 60s. Now we're talking 2012. It's been a long struggle. When you look back over the years, what would you say would be your most lasting achievement, or is that yet still to come?
It's yet still to come.
It is still to come.
It is still to come.
Even after building this multi-billion rand company from scratch.
You must remember, there are still prophets of doom out there that are saying, as a woman, she doesn't know what she's talking about. Okay. I need to make sure that I'm in production come October this year. Then I can say, yes, I've represented not only South African women, not only African women, but women of the world, that women can. This is a world first, this is an African first, but also a South African first, where women started sinking a shaft, almost a mine from cradle to grave. Because you're taking the manganese from the ground, you're beneficiating it from the first level of beneficiating, which is sinter plant. You ship it down to the coast, Kucha, you further beneficiate it to a high carbon ferromanganese, and you export it. And when I've achieved that, I would have represented women across the world, across Africa, and across South Africa. And I would have said, yes, this is what I always wanted to achieve. And we have, as women, a reference point.
Right. Very strong reference point.
Yes, very strong reference point.
And from the government, what do you want?
From the government, I want support.
What kind of support?
Kind of support to learn from such projects, to say, what were the mistakes that I went through, and how can we perfect some of the mistakes? Funding remains a challenge. how do we make things easy for black women to access funding?
Even when we have the IDC.
Even when we have the IDC, the DBSA, the PIC, how do we make decisions easy for women to access funding? Even with the IDC, how do we make sure that people don't just tick the boxes, understand where people are going in terms of job creation, in terms of beneficiation, in terms of industrial development?
What about established business, the white business? We have to use, unfortunately, these racial tags because they are a reality of our economy.
I think in the industry where I am, I was never supported by white business. In actual fact, some of my competitors said that this project will never see the light of day. And I'm happy that they actually did that, because they actually made me to work harder to prove them wrong. White business, I'm not sure whether we're actually ready as black business to actually work at the same level with white business, because they become barriers to entry. There are skeptics in terms of what black people can achieve. Remember that these are people who still were brought up to believe that as black people, you can't think, you're not as clever as they are. It's even worse when we are actually a woman.
It suggests to me that you believe in what the Black Business Council is doing, the separation between the business unit South Africa and the Black Business Council, where you've got, again, this racial division. But in the long term, what benefit do you see that bringing? Isn't it better for business to speak with one voice? Because what you're really looking after, all of you, at the end of the day, is extracting value that benefits communities in which you operate.
I don't think so. If you mix the two, it will always be the story of David versus Goliath.
Can't David help Goliath?
In this case, no.
What would you take?
The rich becomes poorer, the rich becomes richer, and the poorer becomes poor. There will always this notion that there are no skills in the country to perpetuate the status quo, so that mining becomes, for me, I always had a problem to say, if you're saying to me that there are no black skills in the mining industry, I don't understand it, because South Africa has always been a mining country.
Sure.
South Africa represents 80% of PGMs internationally, including manganese. I don't understand why Australia will make more out of manganese than what we are doing, when we represent 80%, 9% is your Kazakhstan, and Australia with 1% of world reserves.
Daphney Mashile-Nkosi, wise words. Member of the class of 1976 Soweto Uprising, a chairman of 4 companies, one of which is listed on the JSE, 5 directorships, a grandmother and a mother. She was talking to us tonight on Africa Prime. Thank you for joining us.